Thank you very much. Thank you again to the University for the very kind invitation to speak. So some of you have heard me speak quite a bit already in the last 2 weeks. I'm extremely impressed and touched that you're here. And it's very, very nice to meet colleagues and students of USP. I'm going to be talking really about the second half of the 19th century, so Victorian Britain, and problems of publishing literature which is canonical but which is problematic. So I'll be talking about a number of publishers with quite different characteristics and thinking about how we define this. Is it censoring activity? Is it not? So we're used to considering Boccaccio's Decameron part of the canon. It's a classic text. It feeds into foundational English literature, English writers like Chaucer. It contributes, he's one of the three writers who contributes to make Italian the first prestigious European vernacular language at a time when English and French were languishing. Boccaccio's Decameron is connected via a continuum of storytelling to narrative traditions which stretch back to antiquity. So it can be odd to think that this is a text which has also sometimes been unwelcome and indeed infamous. We know it was read by literary luminaries of England, such as William and Dorothy Wordsworth, Macaulay, George Eliot, but we're also told that Claire Clairmont, who was a close associate of Byron and the Shelleys, I think this is here, yes, in her respectable old age, she censored her diary to obliterate any record of having read such objectionable texts as the memoirs of courtesan Ninon de l'Enclos and also the works of Boccaccio. So I'd like to look at this text at a time when publishing was under a lot of moral pressure in the United Kingdom. So first we have some context. In Victorian Britain, so a period running 1837 to 1901, we have official prior censorship of stage plays and operas, which also affect translation. So you have to send in your stage play and your opera to the Lord Chancellor's office for censorship. But there's no institutional prior censorship of print media. Instead, it's the self-imposed task of organizations like the Society for the Suppression of Vice and the National Vigilance Society later to prosecute booksellers and publishers for disseminating unacceptable texts. And these prosecutions and the efforts of publishers to avoid prosecution illustrate what André Lefebvre has called the margin. So Lefebvre argues that in order to be heard, a speaker has to express themselves in a zone of acceptability, which he calls the margin. If you try to go outside the margin, you can, but it lays you open to various negative outcomes, including risk and peril, lack of social prestige, such as if you have to publish in Samizdat or in peripheral areas, publication with small presses, poor distribution, loss of jobs, blacklist, or indeed prosecution and jailing, as happened to Vitellius Vitelli. So, as I've argued elsewhere, this is not a defined space, but a liminal zone of operation where agents negotiate norms of acceptability. And this margin in the Victorian period, it gets wider and narrower as time goes by. So it fluctuates in terms of how much latitude there is to publish texts which challenge dominant morals. After the passing of the Obscene Publications Act by Lord Campbell in 1857, there were a number of high-profile trials, including Hicklin in 68, Bradley and Besant in 77, and Visitelli in 88 and 89, which illustrated the shrinking of the margin. The zone of acceptability was getting smaller. And I would characterize censorship in this period under the heading of what Pierre Bourdieu calls structural censorship. So this is exercised through the medium of the sanctions of the field. In other words, it is self-policing. As a community, people decide what, he calls it a market, on which the prices of different kinds of expressions are formed. So I'm going to look at Boccaccio in particular in this period as a writer for whom publishers have to design the context in which he's published quite carefully in order to both make him available and to protect themselves. So I'm going to focus on the ways in which producers of symbolic goods negotiate what may and what may not be said in a group. Okay, and I'm going to look, we're going to have some general observations about publishing in the period, and then we're going to look at a few examples of texts. How many Italianisti do we have in the room? Do we have? Okay, poche ma buone. Okay, so the other theoretical construct I'd like to introduce is something in sociology called the third-person effect hypothesis, which is very wordy. And it was formulated by W. Phillips Davison in the 80s. And Davison argues that basically we all think that other people are more affected by media messages than we are. So for any given media message, we say, oh, think of the children, you know, think of the susceptible, think of people who might be fragile and easily influenced. So he argues that people will tend to overestimate the influence that mass communications have on the attitudes and behaviors of others. More specifically, individuals who are members of an audience exposed to a persuasive communication will expect the communication to have a greater effect on others than themselves. And whether or not they are among the ostensible audience for the message, the impact that they expect this communication to have on others may lead them to take some action. And examples now would be things like violent video games. You know, people say, of course I can play them, you know, I'm okay. But other people, you know, younger people, people who are naturally prone to violence or whatever might be unduly influenced, so we shouldn't have violent video games. And censorship is obviously a very fertile area of investigation for thinking about the third-person effect hypothesis. And literary history offers us many, many examples, from Socrates. You know, people prosecuted Socrates not because he was corrupting them, but because he was corrupting their children. In 1668, the diarist Samuel Pepys writes in his diary about burning a notorious French book called L'École des Filles, which he had already read, because he was worried that his wife would read it. And Pepys' account of that is rather colourful. So with the rise of mass literacy in Victorian Britain in the 19th century, and thus with an enormous rise in the readership for persuasive messages, coupled with a rise in national education policy, which meant that many more people were able to read, and books were much cheaper than they used to be, obviously this is very fertile ground for the third-person effect, because we have very big potential audiences for media messages. And my data suggests that producers of symbolic goods carefully negotiated the relationship between the size of the readership, the cost of the book, and the degree of editing, let's say, censorship, expurgation, which was required, based on the perceived likelihood of either of third parties being negatively affected by the book, or of people thinking that third parties would be negatively affected by the book. Okay, so let's introduce you to, oops, I don't know what happened there. Ignore the master textiles, but that is Henry Bone, a very successful Victorian publisher who successfully exploited a growing readership and also was an enormous publisher of translations. Yes, okay, so that's going to go away in a minute. So he turned a trade in remainders into a book series which would become, in English, an institution. He was the son of a German bookbinder and second-hand bookseller who began his career working with his father, but eventually founded a series of libraries. In 1846, the Standard Library. In 1847, the Scientific and Antiquarian Libraries. 1848, the Classical Library. And then there were various other ecclesiastical, philological, philosophical. The idea was to make improving literature available to a wide readership at a low cost and make a profit. This is important to remember. Translations featured so prominently in his output that Kenneth Haynes considers that it was Henry Bone, more than any other publisher, whose series actively influenced the formation of a canon of world literature in English, at least, translation. And he retired in 1864. He sold his libraries to another publisher, but they went on publishing until the First World War, and they're still in circulation in the second-hand book market. They look like this. Oh, I don't know what's with these images, but this is Aristophanes, literally translated, you can just see on the spine. And one of the things that sold Bone's books was that he was improving previous translations. He was giving you something closer to the original than other publishers had provided, which is obviously very dangerous when you think about writers like Aristophanes, you know, whose material is potentially, you know, slightly eye-widening. Accounts of Bone in the period show us a very energetic man, quite a difficult personality, and the genesis of this standard library, another image of two books, that's Junius in the standard library, show us his commercial ruthlessness. So in 1845, a publisher called David Bogue in Fleet Street began publication of a uniform series called the European Library, which looked very, very like this. I wished I could bring the books with me, but I didn't have enough baggage space. So to show you that physically everything, the binding, the size, the format, the colour, so they're very similar. And he contravened Bone's copyright in some illustrations. And Bone immediately sued him, obtained an injunction, copied his format, undersold him, and then bought all his stuff when he went bankrupt. So Bone was quite an aggressive person in the publishing scene. Obituary writers paid tribute to his energy, his commercial flair, and a talent, let's say, for self-promotion. He wasn't, in Ireland we would say, he wasn't backward in coming forward. Bone's library books came out with a prospectus, like a piece of ephemera, sewn into the inside cover, which was like a prospectus of what he wanted the series to achieve. And, that's what it looks like inside. So these very, very pretty, so a little bit of illustration, nicely produced, but quite simple. Okay, I'm going to have to read you this because it's not in here. So he aimed to provide a series of the best English and foreign authors, printed in a new and elegant form, equally adapted to the library and fireside at the extremely low price of 3 shillings and 6pence per volume. And what he means by the library and the fireside is a reference to the compartmentalization of Victorian reading spaces. I don't know how many of you have, you'll know the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights. Stanley Lane Poole evaluated in 1886 the available translations of the 1001 Nights by saying Galon for the nursery, Lane for the library, Payne for the study, and Burton for the sewers. So, this was how acceptable, would you read it in front of your wife, your children, or would you in fact throw it out? So this was the standard library. Again in 1846, so as soon as the standard library was launched, Bone launched a sub-series called the Extra Volumes, and there were 6 of these. They were published in exactly the same format, but in a different coloured binding. And the idea was that these were books which were not immediately acceptable to Victorian readers. They would be considered racy or potentially rather disgusting, but nevertheless they would sell. So how to get these books to an audience who would buy them while maintaining decorum? And Bone's solution was this. He took this extra volume, and they had a prospectus which said, the publisher, doubting the propriety of including, in this case, the memoirs of Count Grammont in his standard library, thinks it expedient to print them in a separate series under the above title. The binding is of a different colour to mark the distinction. Although universally admitted to be among the most witty and entertaining that have ever been written, these memoirs are, it must be confessed, too much imbued with the leaven of Charles II's days to suit the severer code of the present age. It does a lot of things at once. It sells the book. This is really great. This is a great read. Of course, we know that it's a little bit racy, and so you can tell if your child is reading it because it's a different colour. But it's so they were advertised in the same place. They cost the same amount of money. They were sold through the same channels. So there was no difference in availability between the extra volumes and the standard library, except that they were marked in some way with the mark of Cain. So they included the memoirs of Grammont, some fairy tales by Hamilton, Rabelais' works, Boccaccio's Decameron, Marguerite de Navarre's Heptameron, and the exemplary novels of Cervantes, including a few which might have been apocryphal. Okay, so we see somewhat Bone's attitude. Now, these were works that clearly were in the margin, in a sense. There was their dissemination needed to be negotiated. There's no sense that they were ever going to be prosecuted, these editions of Bones. But some of these books were later very heavily censored in the late Victorian period, indicating that they were problematic. And Bones did have one publication seized by the censor. He published a book of anti-royal cartoons, of satirical cartoons, that was seized and impounded. And that was only really recently rediscovered. Okay. So we're in a situation where he brings these out in 1846 up to 1855. In 1857, the Obscene Publications Bill is passed, and it's introduced to protect society from works written for the single purpose of corrupting the morals of youth.
What?
And of a nature calculated to shock the common feelings of decency in a well-regulated mind.
Yeah.
So in other words, these are books which would shock anyone, even the most sensible person. It wasn't a law that was brought in to censor literature, but gradually as trials and precedent, as judgments and precedents accumulated, it became a tool by which the literature could be prosecuted, and it was the same legislation that prosecuted Lady Chatterley's lover in the 20th century, which was the point at which everyone went, okay, enough. You know. So, the test of censorship was going to be whether the material would deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences, and into whose hands a publication of this sort might fall. This was 1868, and the key distinction is made. It's not about shocking the sensible anymore. It's about, is this available to people who might be able to read it and be corrupted by it? So the key feature of the third person effect is accessibility. And as we can see from reviews of the extra volumes, third persons included women, children, and the less educated. So let's see, do we have an example? No, okay. But to give you a brief hint about the memoirs of Bramont, the Dublin Review said, okay, maybe students of history can see this book, but it cannot be offered as a justification of a cheap, popular edition like the present, intended for the indiscriminate perusal of the motley thousands into whose hands it must fall. So very, very clear judgments there. And the Mirror of Literature, Amusement and Instruction calls it a record of filthy intrigues which should never have been made cheaply accessible to the miscellaneous reader. I'm sure we've all considered ourselves miscellaneous readers. So, okay, and then, so what happened was, time went by. In the 60s, Bone sold his libraries to Bell and Aldi, and then in 68 comes the Hicklin judgment saying availability is the mark of obscenity. If people can get hold of it, it's obscene. If the same book can't be got hold of, it's not obscene. And we learn in 1877 that Bone admits in a newspaper story that the extra volumes had to be withdrawn from circulation. Now we do have sales figures for these books from Alexis Wheaton, and we see that between 1865 and 76, they sold between 1,000 and 4,500 volumes a year, which is a good print run. I mean, these books are selling well, so they're not retired for reasons of money. They're not retired because they're failing. They're retired arguably because they are now showing. Okay, so I'd like to look now at a series of, take the Decameron as an example, and look at a series of editions of the Decameron from this period to see what's happening with the text. We have in 1860, we have from about 1860 the easy availability of pulp paper rather than rag paper. So publications get much cheaper, and so you can buy shilling editions of these books, whereas they were 3 shillings and sixpence for Bone. So in 1884, there's a Decameron is published by Routledge's Universal Library. Now they're like, I think, the publications that have been written about the Clube do Livro, is it, in Brazil? They have a set number of pages. So this is a great excuse for censorship, because when you have a set number of pages where you say, I had to leave some of it out, you know. So the Decameron, the frame narrative, you know, I mean, you'll be familiar with the Decameron, it's 10 days of 10 stories per day. So it's this frame narrative in which these lords and ladies tell each other these comic and improving stories. And so the frame narrative is reproduced. More than half the stories are missing in 1884. And the series editor, Henry Morley, he's using a translation from 1620, and he says, I think this is an okay translation. He's not using Henry Bone's translation, which was much more complete. There's only one tale of Dioneo's left out, and a better story put in, so we can improve Boccaccio, and a little Englishing of dishonest into honest love, so changing the parameters in which relationships are happening. These purifying touches are always very light, and sometimes only perceptible by their effect. In one novel, there is a bolder touch by the translator who changes a couple of things, and so we can include this story. The whole framework of the Decameron is here given, with 40 of its tales out of 100, including all of the best. 10 more might have been given, none of them important, but the book gains much by the omission of the other 50. Indeed, the novels of the Decameron illustrate in their own way the saying drawn from Hesiod that sometimes the half is greater than the whole. And this was very common in discourses of the period, also about Rabelais. These are works of their time. They're great because greatness transcends time, but they are also subject to unfortunate moral failings typical of their source context, which we can now correct. Okay, so if we look at these editions of the Decameron, what's happening in the 19th century? Well, it's one of the better-selling novels in the extra volume series. So it sold 691 in 1864. It was one of the best-selling volumes in all of the hundreds of books in Henry Bone's libraries. But it also had this reputation. In 1831, a bookseller called George Cannon was prosecuted for supplying obscene reading matter, including the Marquis de Sade's Juliette. And Cannon, in his defence, invoked the Decameron as a known obscene volume which could easily be obtained. In other words, it's not wrong to make books available if other similar books are already available. In 1855, one of the reviewers of Walter Kelly's translation of the Decameron asks, "Who has not heard of the Decameron of Boccaccio? How many have read it who would not confess the fact?" So it's a book which, it's there, but you can't admit to reading it, like many books have been. At the end of the period, the Victorian period, the book's erotic reputation was as strong as ever. There's a British Army soldier stationed in India from 1901 to 1909, so right at the end of the Victorian period, is quoted as saying, "In my time, every soldier in the British Army who could read had read the Decameron of Boccaccio from cover to cover." It was considered very hot stuff. So this is a book which we think of as a classic, which in the Victorian period has in certain contexts a reputation as a work of pornography. Okay, so Bone's Decameron, which comes out in 1855, claims to be a new and complete and literal translation, with just a few passages in French and in Italian. So this was how Bone gets past the issue of completeness. It's all in there, but some of it is in a language which you have to know French or Italian to be able to read. There were two stories in particular which were traditionally left in many, many editions over the centuries in Italian or in a French translation. One of them is Day 3, Novel 10, which is the story of the beautiful young convert Alibech, who is taught by the hermit Rustico how to put the devil into hell. And Day 9, Story 10, which is the story of Father Gianni's attempt to pin a tail on his friend's wife, but in order to turn her into a horse. It's a long story, which we won't go into. In 1872, an edition comes out with Chatto and Windus, a very, very reputable publisher, which claims in a frontispiece again, the present edition is complete in capital letters, but a few passages are in French or Italian. In 1884, in Henry Morley's Routledge edition, which costs £1, both of these stories are absent, but we'll see they're not quite absent, as we'll see in a moment. So the demand for expurgated publication also obviously creates demand for complete publication. There are people who can afford the full translation, and if they can, they want it. So in 1886, John Payne publishes a translation for subscribers only with the Villon Society, which was the first complete and unexpurgated translation to be published in English. It cost 3 guineas, or £3 and 3 shillings, which was twice the cost of a 3-volume novel. In other words, it was an incredibly expensive book, and it sold out before publication, as the Leeds Mercury reports in December 86. And it was accurate enough to have been revised and republished it was republished in 2004 in, I think, the Oxford World's Classics. So it was what we would consider an accurate and complete translation, but it could only achieve that accuracy at a price which would put it out of reach of everybody but the very rich. One of the most interesting editions of the Decameron for me is published in 1888 in an edition marked unexpurgated by a publisher called Matheson & Co., owned and operated by one W.M. Thompson. And this is a pirate edition. I've seen one copy of it in the British Library, and it's a cheap and nasty book. It's cheap paper, thin paper, poor covers, bad condition. W.M. Thompson is somebody who gets regularly prosecuted for what he publishes in the Victorian period. He gets published for the Decameron, for this edition, and he also gets prosecuted for the Heptameron about 12 years later. So the National Vigilance Society brings a case against him in 1888 for publishing this Decameron, and the case is thrown out of court because the defendant argues successfully that the text is so widely available in other editions. It's in the British Library, it's in the Guildhall Library of the London Corporation. You know, everybody has access to this text. It's not reasonable to prosecute him for publishing it. Because the reason for prosecuting would be to protect the readers, third person effect. But the readers are already exposed. They have, you can't protect them any more than they already are. But we can make a link between this attempted prosecution and the textual features of the translation. So in other words, out of all the editions we've talked about, why did this one get to court and not the others? So we're going to have a look at some examples. Okay, this is day 9, story 3, Calandrino. Calandrino is, his friends play a joke on him, trying to persuade him that he's pregnant. And he gets very upset when he hears that he's pregnant. So when he hears this, sadly he began to shout and to say, "Oime, Tessa," his wife, "questo m'hai fatto, you did this to me, tu questo m'hai fatto, because you don't want to be anywhere but on top." In other words, they say he could get pregnant if his wife was on top. So the woman, who was a very honest and modest person, hearing her husband speak like this, went scarlet with shame, lowered her face, and went from the room without saying anything. And we're going to look at this and one other text and just see what happens over the Victorian period with this reference. Okay, this is Bone. As soon as Calandrino heard this, he began to roar out and say to his wife, "Oh Tessa, this is all you're doing, che non vuoi altro che di sopra." So suddenly, you can only access what the problem is if you speak Italian. I told you that. And so contextually, you have to interpret the passage that he's saying something shameful, because then we're told that his wife is overcome with shame. And this is, Italian is a language which comes up again and again. Marshall, the poet Marshall, who is also published by Bone, at a time when nobody else was publishing Marshall, a lot of the poems in Italian. Okay, so this is 1855. This is our extra volume. This is Chatto and Windus in 1872. As soon as he heard this, he began to roar out and say to his wife, "Alas, this is all you're doing." But the explanation has disappeared. By the way, it's extremely warm in here. Would it be
I'm afraid it's broken. It's broken. All we can do, we can try to open the curtain.
Perhaps if we had a little bit, or even if we could open this door a crack and have a little bit of a breeze through. I feel bad for the intense heat.
Yeah, that's a bit better.
Are you happy for us to continue?
Yeah.
Let's see if we get a little bit more fresh. Okay. So Chatto and Windus.
Isn't the fan working?
They delete.
It's going to make a noise.
The bits
we can press the fan on.
I'm worried that I'm going to pass out. Okay. So then we move on to our. Oh no, I'm okay, but I just see people in the audience, slightly looking at
It's the subject matter.
Yes, okay. In this case, it's the first person.
Some of the ladies might be fainting.
Yes, I should have made everybody sign a disclaimer or something before. Anyway, so in 1886 we have our Villon Society translation by Payne. So this is the very literal, very expensive one. And we can see, "Woe is me, Tessa, this is thy doing, for that thou wilt still be uppermost. I told thee how it would be." So one of the things we see is that this archaizes the text in a way to make it more dignified, more worthy of being a classical text. That's very archaic. Okay, so this is 1886. This is Matheson in 1888. Aha, okay. So he says, "Tessa, what have you done with me? Done by not consenting to be with me except from above." So this is pretty explicit, and it's in English, and it's very cheap. And so this is, it's not any one factor, but it's the combination of all of these factors which allow us to suggest that when we look at these points of friction or tension in the text, that Matheson's approach is one which is insufficiently expurgating, insufficiently preserving of the modesty of the text. Okay, so that's Calandrino. Now I'm not sure how easy this is going to be to read. No, let's see. Okay, some of them will be reasonably good. Okay, this is day 3, story 10, an infamous story in which Alibek, the convert, is seduced by the hermit Rustico, and there are various. It's both anti-religious and immoral. So you have he speaks of the relief he gets from putting the devil into hell, and she says, "Please explain to me how the devil is put into hell," and he explains, and it gets rather anatomical. And what we see happening in this text is, for me, very, very interesting. And we're just looking at a selection. So in 1855, and I'm sorry, hopefully at least you will see the point at which the text switches from English to Italian.
Yeah.
So he says, "Do as you see me do." He slips off his garments. The girl does the same, and they go down their knees to pray, and then something happens in Italian. And there's a conversation between Alibek and Rustico. So this is the point for Bohm in 1855, where the text can no longer be in English. And for me, this is, it's almost like a temperature gauge, as you'll see. So, this is Chateau Windus in 1872. She demanded of him how it was to be done, how the devil was to be put into hell, which he immediately proceeded to explain. And he immediately into Italian. So in other words, Italian is growing, the incidence of Italian is growing in the text to encompass the act of them taking their clothes off for her and kneeling down as if to pray and so on. And we have this star. He immediately proceeded to explain. And there's a footnote. And the footnote says, "The translators regret that the disuse into which magic has fallen makes it impossible to render the technicals of that mysterious art into tolerable English. They have therefore found it necessary to insert several passages in the original Italian. To those who are acquainted with the French language, the version of a few passages by Mirabeau will be sufficient to throw some light on these difficulties." So what's happening here? The decorum is being preserved. The text itself is clearly not expurgated, but left in the original, left in an inaccessible form, while not being in any way incomplete. And they make it a translation problem. It's no longer a problem of immorality. It's not a problem of norms or of subject matter. It's a problem of translation. But it's very arch. It's very obviously. I mean, a linguistic pragmatist would say there is implicature upon implicature in this text. They are inviting the reader to share the joke. So it's an informed readership. They're not trying to hide the existence of something. This is for an informed readership where everybody knows that these norms exist and aren't they silly, but we have to observe them. But they also are, it's quite titillating as well. They're saying, well, you could watch it, you could see it in French, you can read it in Italian. And this is typical of Bohm's footnotes also in some of his classical texts. The footnotes become not just a mode of censorship, but a mode of making visible the censorship, and also a mode of promoting the text as a text which is so exciting that it has to be censored. So in a sense, the censorship becomes part of the entertainment in the text. If we look at Morley, Henry Morley, in 1884, where this story was completely omitted from with many other stories from the translation, he omits the story, but he doesn't omit the rubric, because at this point there's a rubric which explains at the head of each story what the story is. And Alibek, the young convert to Christianity, goes into the desert of the Thebaid, where Rustico teaches him how to put the devil into hell. So suddenly Alibek is a man, not a woman. So what's going on there? Is it simply a printer's error? Or is it a way of avoiding the implication of ill practice by taking away the heterosexual couple from the text, which might be more obviously something that the readers might see as censoring? In any case, it has this rather paradoxically, at least to today's reader, this rather paradoxically counterproductive effect. Okay, so this is David Morley, and then now we're looking at 1888 at Matheson's, W.M. Thompson's translation from Matheson. And this is what Matheson puts. So the entire text is in English. And we can see that there is not only a series of sexual innuendos, but there's also a very blasphemous reference to the resurrection of the flesh, which is in Italian or French in other texts. And the text is, again, quite archaic, but certainly literal, and literal on the same level that, say, Matheson, that say Payne might have used for veal. So again, what's interesting here is that there is a French translation, but it's in a footnote. So it's not. So there's something about the paratextual space of the page and the space of Victorian decorum, which is why I mentioned this idea of the different rooms of Victorian decorum earlier. That, but by having the foreign language in the body of the text and the translation in the footnote, it's somehow still more decorous than having the translation in the body of the text and the French text in the footnote. So he is flagrantly, offending against, at this point, a number of Victorian norms. Okay. There are other editions of this text. There are many other editions of this text in the period. In the expensive 3 guinea Payne edition of 1886 gets reissued in 1893 in a cheaper illustrated edition, and there it's very, very interesting because the passage turns into French again. So you can really see it's like a hemline. It's almost like a hemline on a skirt. You know, you could measure norms by where exactly in the text and how geographically as well as linguistically the censorship takes place. There's another version that published in 1895 and 1896 in 4 volumes, illustrated, which again slips into French even earlier than the text that we've been looking at. But interestingly, the illustrated volumes are not always as decorous in their illustrations as in their text. So there's this very odd, quite contradictory, internally contradictory set of discourses, which lead us to see the complexity of the margin, if you like, of the functioning of the margin in the Victorian period. So all of Matheson's very, let's see, where are we at? Okay. Oh no, sorry, I'm totally wrong. It's Payne and Matheson. Please excuse that. Okay. So, but the resurrection of the flesh, so blasphemy present in English in the Matheson translation. None of this would have been sufficient to have Thomson prosecuted if he hadn't, as one commentator put it, flooded the town. So he had a very, very high print run, and there were an enormous number of the copies of this text in circulation. And we could argue that he was never in serious danger of conviction, but the attempted prosecution shows to what extent Matheson is close to the margin, and by comparison we can then see how Bone negotiates his position in the margin by, he's lucky in the period in which he makes the books available, but the publishing company then adapts their strategy and the availability of the books depending on the changing climate. In 1900, Matheson brings out an edition of Marguerite de Navarre's Heptameron, and during the trial, the jury are asked whether the fact that the book was sold for 1 shilling and 11 would clearly tend to the corruption of morals. So really, this we can see the corruption is about the price, not about the text. Okay, so the above survey, a brief survey of editions of the Decameron, demonstrates the range of strategies available to Victorian publishers to exploit the reputation of classic works while distancing themselves from their problematic content. But it also demonstrates the existence of specifically translation-focused forms of censorship. In this case, the play with paratext and the use of the original language or of alternative translations as a way of keeping texts out of reach. We also see in the discourse the argument that obscenity is a property of the translation, not of the text. So we have some prefaces which say this text has a terrible reputation, but this is because previous translators have been most lax and immoral. So at the heart of these negotiations of acceptability is a set of acknowledged but mutable canons of propriety. Bone was demonstrably able to judge the boundaries well enough to avoid the deployment of Bourdieu's sanctions of the field against the extra volumes. And we see in Bone's prefaces to his own books his understanding of where the norms are. So in the edition of Marshall, he writes, "In those instances where an English translation given faithfully would not be tolerable," we've used an Italian translation by Graglia. So would not be tolerable is his account of his assumption of what as a community, the norms would be. And in relation to the extra volumes, his successors also show acumen in withdrawing them from sale at the point where they might give offence. In a survey of translation censorship, Francesca Biliani suggests that it operates largely according to criteria and values established by a dominant body over a dominated body. And the dominant body can often be identified with the visible face of institutional powers, or with social conventions that rule one's freedom of choice and expression, both at a public and personal level. And I would argue that Victorian Britain offers a more complex, a more heterogeneous picture in which many agents contribute both to sustaining and to subverting censorship. So the publisher who makes a decision whether to bring a book out, how to frame it, when to take it out of circulation, the reviewer who assesses a book's acceptability within the field, the poor Mr. Gurney of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, whose lawsuits kept getting thrown out of court, only not always, in which case he found that his definition of unacceptable literature wasn't shared by the wider community, and also the judges, the jurors, the publishers, and the readers. So this tiered system, in which spatial metaphors of libraries and drawing rooms expressed a relationship between the cost of books and their routes of circulation, was sustained by a deep belief, not only in community standards, but in the greater applicability of those standards to other people. In other words, the third person effect makes censorship at once imperative and never entirely effective. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments, clarification?
Yes, so sorry, that's just more moment. He's very canny because his books are brought in for mechanics institutes, for areas of further education, for workers, they're very, very, very improving. And yet he has quite a large volume of work which he sells as titillating literature, and there doesn't seem to be any dissonance in terms of his reputation. When he dies, his obituaries say his translations were often boring, but always useful. They don't say what a terrible man.
She's asking about when was the first time Boccaccio was translated to English?
Well, there's a 1620 translation, which is quite free. Yes, I think there are fragments. Well, I think there are fragments of stories in circulation. I mean, Boccaccio is an interesting one because there are. I can't remember which scholar, but somebody in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, listening to which was still until quite recently an oral storytelling culture until the middle of the 20th century, where entertainment was provided by people reproducing stories with their own spin on them. Boccaccio stories were heard being told in this environment as oral literature, so the reach is absolutely enormous. So there were versions of some stories, but I don't. There's a book coming out this September, which is a full survey of Boccaccio in English by a very, very fine scholar, which should be very interesting.
But this period wasn't the first time it was translated.
No, by no means. In fact, explicitly, the 1855 translation is saying we are retranslating this book because it has been inadequately translated so far. One of the things that happened was that there's a whole proemio, there's a whole, a paratextual apparatus beyond the story of introduction by Boccaccio, and a lot of that is left out of early translations, so this is provided back to the text.
I didn't get exactly who issued this third person effect hypothesis.
Oh, his name is W. Phillips Davison, and it was in 1983, I think, the article came out, where he first, where is it?
It's right at the beginning.
It was. There we are. Yes, I am happy to supply the reference. So W. Philip Davison, his name was, and what happened? This has been research which is quite. The hypothesis has been quite extensively researched in areas like censorship, where people look now to see how much, for instance, if somebody feels a message is dangerous, how likely are they to be in favour of censorship? So people trying to establish whether this effect operates and what effect it has on people, lobbying for censorship. And I think some research that I've read more recently suggests that it operates regardless of a number of factors. It's not affected by gender, age, socioeconomic bracket, I don't think. So there seems to be a generalizability about this hypothesis.
Is this only an English-speaking word that this hypothesis?
Well, the research that I know of is in English, but I would be surprised if that was the only place where the research had been deployed. I think that it's actually it's not a very scholarly article in some ways. It's this is what I think, it's an article that says, I think this is the case. But it's a compelling enough idea that people have picked it up and worked more rigorously on it. But I think that he's basically saying, this is how it works in general, and he considers it to be something that is generalizable across cultures and so on. But of course, we can see that I think we probably have to distinguish between the third person effect hypothesis, which says where messages are perceived to be harmful, people may be in favour of censoring, and then the historical and social specifics of what is considered harmful when. Because in Britain, for instance, in the 16th, 17th century, they're much more interested in political and religious censorship than they are in moral, sexual censorship. In the Victorian period, they're not as interested, so different things are problematic at different times. And that is culturally specific, of course, yes.
Also, which text the FFLCH spoke about this margin theory? Because you spoke about that, but you didn't mention the text.
No.
Why did we speak about that?
Let me just have a look. Let me see if it is in mine. In the article, there's a seminal article from 1984 called Translation and Other Ways in Which One Literature Refracts Another. I'm happy to send you a copy of if you like, by email. It's from a journal called Symposium. It's not that easy to get hold of, but I think maybe in interlibrary loan, or there might be photocopies around, but it's one of Lefebvre's more interesting.
Yeah, I would like to ask.
So the text is one.
Symposium. Translation review. Did you publish the translation review? I'm not sure where Symposium came out. It's that one. Symposium of Quarterly Journal of Modern Literature. Was that the text is published? Okay.
I think I have it. I think I have this. Yeah. Yes. Because the area which is much more sensitive nowadays is that of race. This all seems very quaint to us nowadays, but we have our own problems in dealing with texts which involve racial slurs.
And there are regular problems with complaints about books in children's libraries in the United States, for instance. You must withdraw such and such a book because it's racist or because of the reasons.
Health and safety is another.
Yes.
You can't have children and children's books smoking.
You can't smoke on stage anymore.
Playing with guns,
You can't smoke on stage in the West End anymore, even if the play calls for it. So, yes, it's a form of...
Okay, I think we can give Carol a bit of a rest now. And wish her a pleasant trip back to Portsmouth and then Bristol and then...
Hopefully it's a point.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.